Tonight, we are going to explore a very slow and boring history. This story is designed to help you relax, unwind, and gently fall asleep. So find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let's begin. When archaeologists analyze residue in medieval glass vessels, they find evidence of chemical reactions that weren't supposed to be discovered until 400 years later. The equipment survives. Not all of it. Not even most of it. But enough. In museum collections across Europe, in archaeological sites, in monastery cellars that haven't been disturbed for centuries, the tools of medieval alchemy remain. And they tell a story that contradicts everything we've been taught about medieval science. Glass alembics with long, curved necks, designed for distillation. Retorts with bulbous bodies and angled spouts. Crucibles made from ceramic that could withstand extreme heat, still stained with metallic residues. Furnaces built with multiple chambers, each maintaining different temperature zones. Copper vessels showing evidence of corrosion patterns that only occur with specific chemical exposures. Bronze equipment with traces of substances that shouldn't have been isolated in the medieval period. Modern chemical analysis makes the truth undeniable. Scrape residue from the inside of a 13th century glass vessel and test it. You'll find compounds that match nitric acid preparation, mercury amalgams, sulfur-based preparations, metal salts dissolved in acidic solutions, plant alkaloids extracted and concentrated. The chemical signatures are clear, specific, unmistakable. These weren't decorative objects. They were working laboratory equipment used for systematic chemical processing. Manuscript illustrations show how it all fit together. The furnace at the center, not a simple fire pit, but a carefully designed structure with different heating zones. The main chamber where temperatures could reach extreme heat. Side chambers for gentler warming. Ventilation channels that drew smoke away while maintaining consistent heat. Medieval alchemists understood temperature control mattered. Different reactions required different heat levels, and their furnaces could provide them. Glassware arranged in sequences. One vessel heated over flame, its vapors rising into a second vessel where they condensed, dripping into a third vessel for collection. Distillation systems that could separate substances based on different boiling points. The same principle modern chemistry uses. The same equipment, really. Retorts and alembics from the 13th century look remarkably similar to those used in 18th century chemistry labs. Weighing scales accurate to fractions of a gram. Grinding equipment, mortars and pestles, some stone, some metal, for preparing minerals and plant materials. Storage vessels made from materials resistant to corrosion, carefully sealed, often labeled with symbols indicating content. Dangerous substances required safe storage. Alchemists knew this. Their equipment reflects that knowledge. The sophistication is undeniable. This wasn't primitive trial and error. Laboratory setups followed logical organization. Heat sources positioned for optimal use. Ventilation arranged to protect the practitioner. Equipment scaled appropriately for the procedures being conducted. Everything purposeful. Everything designed. Safety measures are evident too. Furnace arrangements included chimney systems that vented dangerous fumes outside. Thick leather gloves survive in some collections, stained with chemical residue. aprons made from treated fabric resistant to acid splashes, knowledge about which substances couldn't be stored together, which combinations produced dangerous reactions, which vapors required ventilation. Alchemists weren't reckless. They were careful, methodical. They understood that chemistry was dangerous work requiring precautions. Walk through a reconstructed medieval alchemical laboratory, and the impression is unmistakable. This would be recognizable to an 18th century chemist, maybe even to a modern chemist working with basic equipment. The principles haven't changed. Heat sources, distillation apparatus, separation techniques, careful measurement, proper storage. The fundamentals of practical chemistry were already established. What's missing from modern labs? The symbolic decorations, the astrological charts, the mystical imagery. Strip those away, and what remains is functional chemistry equipment arranged for systematic experimentation. The tools tell the truth that later histories tried to obscure. Medieval alchemy wasn't mystical nonsense. It was practical chemistry, conducted with sophisticated equipment by people who understood what they were doing. But tools are useless without knowledge of how to use them. And the knowledge medieval alchemists possessed came from books that were dangerous to own. There were books in medieval Europe that you could read in secret, or you could own publicly, but not both. These books didn't contain spells or curses. They contained procedures, and procedures were more dangerous than magic. The Emerald Tablet was short, fewer than a dozen lines in most versions. Attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary figure blending the Greek god Hermes with the Egyptian god Thoth. It was considered foundational to alchemical philosophy. The text was cryptic, almost poetic. As above, so below. The father is the sun, the mother the moon. Lines that could be interpreted 1,000 different ways. Alchemists spent lifetimes trying to decode it, not because it was mystical nonsense, but because they believed it contained encoded procedures. Symbolic language protecting actual chemical knowledge. Some succeeded in extracting meaning. Others got lost in interpretation. But possessing a copy marked you as someone interested in transformation, in perfection, in understanding principles the Church preferred remained mysterious. The book of the composition of alchemy, attributed to Morianus, was more explicit. One of the earliest Latin alchemy texts, translated from Arabic in the 12th century, it described practical procedures, how to prepare certain substances, which materials to combine, what to expect during heating. The language was still symbolic. The white stone and the red stone, the green lion. But readers who understood the code could extract actual chemical instructions. Owning it was risky. The text came from Islamic sources. That alone made it suspicious in a Europe engaged in crusades against Muslim territories. But more than that, it advocated experimentation, trying things, observing results, adjusting methods based on what you saw rather than what authority claimed should happen. Works by Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in Latin as Geber, were even more dangerous. Hundreds of treatises, translated from Arabic, containing detailed chemical procedures. How to distill acids, how to prepare mercury, how to classify substances based on their properties and behaviors. This wasn't philosophy. These were laboratory manuals, step-by-step instructions that could be followed and verified. The church tolerated them for a while, then didn't. Copies disappeared from university libraries. Private collections were seized. Owning Geber's works could trigger inquisitorial investigation. Roger Bacon's Opus Majus was dangerous for different reasons. Bacon was a Franciscan friar, educated, respected initially. His great work advocated for experimental science as the path to knowledge. He argued that observation and testing should verify or disprove what ancient authorities claimed. He described optical experiments, astronomical observations, chemical procedures. He suggested that direct investigation of nature could correct errors in scripture interpretation. That last part got him imprisoned, by his own order, for years. But his manuscripts circulated anyway. Students copied them secretly. Private libraries maintained banned works. An underground network of book traders moved forbidden texts between universities, between courts, between scholars willing to risk possessing them. Anonymous manuscripts were perhaps most common. No named author. Often no title, just procedures and observations, copied and recopied, passed from master to student. Some were clearly practical. Recipes for medicines, instructions for preparing materials, metallurgical techniques. Others were more theoretical, discussing the nature of transformation, the principles underlying chemical change. The dangerous ones weren't hard to identify. They shared certain characteristics. They advocated direct experimentation over received authority. They suggested humans could manipulate and perfect matter through understanding and technique, abilities supposedly reserved for God. They contained knowledge derived from Islamic sources in a Europe that associated Islam with religious enemies. They implied that natural processes operated according to discoverable laws that could be understood and controlled through human reason, without need for divine revelation. That last implication was most threatening. If nature's secrets could be unlocked through systematic investigation, what did that say about the Church's role as sole interpreter of truth? Texts were copied in monasteries, ironically. Monks in scriptoriums created illuminated versions, adding symbolic imagery to margins. Dragons and lions, suns and moons, elaborate allegorical illustrations. This decoration served dual purpose. It made the manuscripts beautiful, worthy of preservation, and it made them defensible. If questioned, symbolic language could be presented as spiritual allegory about the soul's transformation, not literal chemical procedures. Students hand-copied texts from their masters, creating personal libraries. These copies were cruder, focused on content over beauty. Margins filled with notes, annotations, clarifications. This means saltpeter. The red lion is gold. Heat until the color changes from green to blue. The code being decoded by those who needed to use it. Networks emerged. Book traders who specialized in forbidden texts. They'd arrive at a university town, quietly spread word they had certain manuscripts available. Transactions happened in private. Money changed hands. The manuscript disappeared into a scholar's personal collection, to be read behind locked doors, copied if deemed valuable enough, then hidden again. Some coded their text deliberately. Not mysticism, protection. If authorities found your book, obscure symbolic language gave you options. I was studying spiritual transformation, not chemical procedures. See, it's all allegory about the soul's purification. Clear, explicit chemical instructions offered no such defense. The penalties were real. Records survive of scholars punished for possessing alchemical texts. Fines, confiscation of libraries, expulsion from universities. In extreme cases, worse. The Inquisition took interest in what people read. Certain books on your shelf could trigger investigation into your beliefs, your practices, your orthodoxy. And yet the texts survived. Copied despite danger. Hidden but preserved. Passed down through generations of scholars who believed the knowledge was worth the risk. Because these books contained something genuinely valuable. Not spells, not supernatural secrets, but systematic observations about how the material world actually worked, procedures that could be tested and verified, knowledge that challenged official doctrines not through argument but through demonstration. You could debate theology with the church and possibly survive. But if you owned a book that described how to create substances that dissolved gold, supposedly the perfect, incorruptible element, you possessed evidence that official teachings about matter's fixed nature might be wrong. Evidence was more dangerous than opinion. Procedures were more threatening than philosophy. These books described procedures. So what exactly were these alchemists trying to make? When an alchemist wrote, "Take the green lion and dissolve it in aqua fortis," he wasn't speaking in riddles. He was telling you exactly how to make nitric acid. You just needed to know the code. The experiments were specific, documented, reproducible. Medieval alchemists kept notebooks, detailed records of what they did, what they observed, what worked, and what failed. These weren't vague, mystical musings. They were laboratory journals. Distillation was fundamental. Take fermented wine or beer. Heat it in a retort. Collect the vapors as they condense in a cooled vessel. The liquid that collects is stronger, more concentrated. Heat it again. Collect the distillate. Repeat. Each cycle increases the alcohol content. They were conducting fractional distillation, separating substances based on different boiling points. The principle is identical to what modern distilleries use. Medieval alchemists discovered that temperature mattered. Heat wine gently, and you get one distillate. Heat it more aggressively, and different substances come over. They noted these differences, documented the temperatures, not with thermometers, which didn't exist yet, but by observing flame color, by how the glass glowed, by experiential markers that came from repeated practice. The alcohol they produced wasn't for drinking. It was aqua vitae, water of life, used primarily as a solvent for medicines. But the process itself was chemistry. Systematic separation of components based on physical properties. Acid preparation was more complex. Start with nitra, saltpeter, potassium nitrate. Grind it fine. Mix it with vitriol, what we call sulfuric acid, which they obtained from heating green vitriol, iron sulfate. Heat this mixture carefully in a glass retort. Collect the vapors. What condenses is aqua fortis, strong water, nitric acid. The manuscripts describe it in symbolic language. Take the dragon's blood and the water of the moon. But the procedures underneath the symbols are clear. Specific proportions, heating instructions, safety warnings about the vapors, descriptions of what the acid looks like, how it behaves, what it can dissolve. Silver dissolves in aqua fortis. The alchemists knew this, documented it, used it for separating silver from gold in mixed metals. The acid would dissolve silver, but leave gold untouched. A practical application of chemistry for assaying and refining precious metals. But they went further. Mix aqua fortis with muriatic acid, hydrochloric acid, which they made from salt and vitriol. This combination creates aqua regia, royal water. And aqua regia dissolves gold. Think about what that meant. Gold was supposed to be perfect, incorruptible, the element that couldn't be broken down or destroyed. Church-approved Aristotelian philosophy depended on gold's immutability as evidence of divine order. Then alchemists discovered a substance that made gold disappear into solution. The implications were enormous. If gold could be dissolved, it wasn't immutable. If the perfect element could be broken down, the entire philosophical framework linking material perfection to divine order was questionable. They documented this carefully. Exactly how to prepare aqua regia, what ratio of acids worked best, how the gold dissolved. First turning the solution yellow, then darker as more dissolved. They tested whether the dissolved gold could be recovered. It could. Precipitate it back out using other substances. The gold returned, proving it hadn't been destroyed, just transformed into a different state. This was careful experimental work, not wild speculation. Systematic observation of chemical reactions. Mercury preparation was another focus. Heat cinnabar, a red mineral, mercury sulfide, in a retort. As it heats, silver liquid begins to condense in the collection vessel. Quicksilver, elemental mercury. They observed it, documented it, theorized about what it meant. Mercury was strange, a metal that flowed like water, impossibly dense. It dissolved other metals, forming amalgams. Gold placed in mercury would seem to vanish, absorbed into the quicksilver, then could be recovered by heating the amalgam. The mercury would evaporate, leaving gold behind. This behavior suggested to alchemists that mercury might be a primal substance, a component of other metals. If you could get the mercury in just the right state, combine it with just the right sulfur, perhaps you could create gold. The theory was wrong, but it was based on careful observation of actual chemical behavior. Metal purification techniques developed through similar experimentation. Cupellation, heating impure gold or silver with lead in a porous vessel. The lead oxidizes, absorbing base metal impurities, and soaks into the porous cupel. Pure gold or silver remains. This process is still used in metallurgy. Medieval alchemists developed it, refined it, documented the precise procedures. Pharmaceutical preparations occupied much alchemical effort, distilling plant essences into concentrated forms, creating tinctures by dissolving herbal materials in alcohol, compounding medicines that combined multiple ingredients in specific proportions. These preparations were genuinely medicinal because the distillation process concentrated active compounds. An alchemist preparing medicine would record which plants, harvested when, prepared how, distilled at what temperature, combined in what sequence. Success and failure were noted. If a preparation worked reliably, the procedure was preserved. If it failed, the alchemist tried variations, adjusting variables systematically to identify what mattered. This was experimental method. Hypothesis, test, observe, adjust, repeat. Gunpowder development followed similar patterns. The basic formula, sulfur, charcoal, saltpeter, came from China. But European alchemists refined it through systematic experimentation. Different ratios produced different effects. Finer grinding increased power. Moisture content mattered. Storage methods affected reliability. Notebooks documented these variations. 75 parts saltpeter, 15 charcoal, 10 sulfur. Burns fast but weak explosion. Same ratio, finer grinding, stronger effect. Moistened mixture, then dried. More stable storage. Trial and error, yes, but systematic trial and error. Each test informed the next. Consider one specific experiment, documented in detail. Preparing aqua fortis. The alchemist sets up his apparatus, a glass retort containing the mixture of nitra and vitriol. The retort positioned over a furnace. A receiving flask connected to the retort's neck to collect distillate. Everything sealed carefully. He begins heating. Gradually. Too fast and the glass might crack. He watches the mixture. As temperature rises, it begins to bubble. Vapors rise into the retort's neck. The alchemist notes the color. Reddish-brown fumes. The smell is sharp. Choking. He's learned to avoid breathing it directly. The vapors condense in the receiving flask. Clear at first, then slightly yellow. He continues heating, watching temperature by the flame's color, by how the glass responds. The distillation continues for hours. Slow, patient. Chemistry cannot be rushed. When finished, he has aqua fortis. He tests it. A small piece of silver dropped into a sample. The silver dissolves with violent fizzing. Gas bubbles off. The solution turns blue-green from dissolved silver. The acid works. He records everything. The ratio of starting materials, the heating time, the color and smell of vapors, the yield of acid, the test results. Next time, He might adjust proportions, try different heating rates, see if he can improve the process. This is science. Not the science of formal theories and mathematical laws. That would come later. But science as systematic investigation. Observation, documentation, variation, refinement. Medieval alchemists were doing chemistry. Real chemistry. And their experiments produced results. Real, measurable, reproducible results. And some of those results changed the world. But not in the ways you'd expect. Medieval alchemists created medicines that actually worked. And that was more dangerous than if they'd failed completely. The pursuit started innocently enough. Alchemists believed that wine contained a spirit, an essence that could be separated from the earthly liquid that carried it. Distill wine repeatedly, and you could isolate this quintessence, this pure spiritual substance. They called it aqua vitae, water of life. What they actually created was soy-proof alcohol. Ethanol concentrated far beyond what natural fermentation could achieve. And almost immediately, they discovered it had properties that revolutionized medicine. Alcohol dissolved things water couldn't touch. Plant medicines that barely worked when prepared as teas became potent when extracted into alcohol. The alcohol pulled out compounds, alkaloids, resins, volatile oils that contained the actual medicinal effects. A tincture made from the same herb that produced a weak tea could be dramatically more effective because the alcohol had concentrated the active ingredients. More than that, alcohol preserved. A water-based herbal preparation would spoil within days. An alcohol-based tincture lasted indefinitely. This meant medicines could be prepared in advance, stored, transported. A monastery infirmary could maintain a pharmacy of ready treatments. A traveling physician could carry effective remedies. The sick could receive standardized doses of medicines whose potency didn't degrade over time. Arnold of Villanova, working in the 13th century, wrote extensively about distilled medicines. He documented specific preparations, exact procedures for extracting different herbs into alcohol. His texts describe compound medicines, multiple herbs extracted together, their effects combining synergistically in ways single herb preparations didn't achieve. He tested dosages, noted which concentrations worked for which ailments, recorded side effects and contraindications. This was pharmaceutical science, systematic development of medicines based on observed clinical effects. John of Rupascissa took it further. He believed that through repeated distillation and careful preparation, he could create quintessences, medicines so purified and concentrated they represented the perfected essence of healing. His preparations required weeks of work, careful extraction, multiple distillations, precise combination of ingredients. The medicines he created were expensive, reserved for wealthy patrons who could afford such elaborate treatments. But they worked. Modern chemical analysis of traditional formulas prepared by his methods shows genuine pharmaceutical activity. The compounds he concentrated were the same active ingredients modern medicine isolates and synthesizes. Anonymous practitioners, less famous but perhaps more important, operated the medieval equivalent of pharmacies. Apothecary alchemists who distilled medicines for their communities. They prepared tinctures for pain, for fever, for digestive complaints. They created salves and ointments using alchemically prepared ingredients. They compounded preparations according to formulas passed down through generations of practitioners, formulas that had been refined through centuries of trial and observation. These medicines saved lives, not metaphorically, actually saved people who would have died without treatment. Infections that might have turned fatal were treated with antiseptic alcohol preparations. Pain that would have been unbearable was managed with opiate tinctures prepared at effective concentrations. Digestive disorders were addressed with herbal extracts that genuinely aided digestion. Fevers were reduced with medicines whose active compounds modern science has confirmed. The alchemists understood solubility in ways that prefigured modern pharmaceutical chemistry. They knew that different substances required different solvents. Some medicines extracted better in alcohol, others needed oil. Some required acidic solutions. They documented which herbs responded to which solvents, creating a practical knowledge base about chemical solubility centuries before the theory was formalized. Dosage standardization emerged from this work. An alchemist preparing medicine would measure carefully. The same amount of herb, extracted in the same amount of alcohol, for the same duration, produced consistent results. This allowed for predictable dosing. A physician could prescribe a specific amount, knowing it would have the expected effect. Compare this to crude herbal preparations, where potency varied wildly depending on plant freshness, preparation method, and countless other variables. The medical establishment, such as it was, initially welcomed these developments. Better medicines were better for everyone. Monastery infirmaries, university medical faculties, court physicians all incorporated alchemical pharmaceutical techniques into their practice. But this created a problem the church couldn't ignore. If alchemy produced medicines that demonstrably healed people, how could it be demonic? If alchemical methods created treatments more effective than traditional remedies, how could the practice be fraudulent? If systematic distillation and extraction yielded genuine pharmaceutical benefits, how could experimentation be dismissed as misguided? Success undermined the narrative that alchemy was foolish pursuit of impossible goals. Worse, it validated the methodology, systematic experimentation, careful observation, documentation, and refinement of procedures based on results. The same approach that produced effective medicines was being applied to other alchemical investigations. And those investigations were producing discoveries that challenged church doctrine in ways medicine didn't. The church faced an uncomfortable choice: condemn all alchemy, including pharmaceutical applications, and lose access to the best medicines available, or allow pharmaceutical alchemy while suppressing other branches, creating an arbitrary distinction that would be difficult to maintain. They chose suppression anyway. But the medicines survived. Too useful to eliminate. Too effective to dismiss. Pharmaceutical alchemy continued under different names. Its techniques absorbed into medical practice, while its alchemical origins were quietly erased from official histories. The formulas remained. The procedures persisted. The knowledge endured, transformed into medicine, and separated from alchemy as if they'd never been the same thing. But medicine wasn't the only practical discovery emerging from alchemical laboratories. Some experiments produced results that literally changed warfare. The formula for gunpowder was written in code by a monk who would be imprisoned for knowing too much. Within a century, that formula had toppled kingdoms and made medieval warfare obsolete. Gunpowder came from China. The basic discovery that saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal combined in certain proportions would burn explosively was Chinese. They used it for fireworks, for signals, for weapons that were more terrifying than effective. The knowledge reached Europe through the Mongol conquests, through trade routes, through the slow diffusion of ideas across continents. But what arrived in Europe was a curiosity, a novelty. It took European alchemists to transform it into a military technology that would reshape warfare and ultimately reshape civilization itself. Roger Bacon described gunpowder in his writings. Not openly, in code, a cipher that only those who already suspected what he was talking about could decode. He knew the formula was dangerous, not because it was demonic, because it worked, because it gave whoever possessed it power that could overthrow traditional military hierarchies. Knights in armor had dominated European warfare for centuries. Heavy cavalry, protected by expensive equipment that required years of training to use effectively, were the elite military force. Castles and fortified positions could withstand siege for months. Warfare was slow, expensive, and heavily favored the established nobility who could afford the equipment and training. Gunpowder changed everything. European alchemists didn't just copy the Chinese formula. They experimented with it. Systematically. They varied the proportions of the three components. 75 parts saltpeter, 15 charcoal, 10 sulfur became standard, but getting there required testing dozens of ratios. Too much sulfur, and it burned too fast. More flash than force. Too little, and it wouldn't ignite reliably. The charcoal had to be prepared correctly. Wood burned in oxygen-poor conditions to create highly porous carbon. The saltpeter, potassium nitrate, required purification. Natural saltpeter contained impurities that affected how the powder burned. Alchemists developed refining techniques, dissolving crude saltpeter in water, filtering, recrystallizing. Pure saltpeter produced more reliable, more powerful powder. Grain size mattered. Grind the powder too fine, and it burned almost instantaneously, useful for priming charges, but dangerous as a main explosive. Leave it coarser, and it burned more slowly, building pressure gradually. Different applications required different grain sizes. Alchemists documented these differences, creating specialized powders for different uses. German alchemists, working for princes who saw the military potential, developed the first effective European cannons. Early versions were as dangerous to their operators as to their targets. Barrels burst. Charges detonated prematurely. But systematic experimentation refined the technology. Stronger barrels, better powder, improved ignition methods. Italian alchemists created refined gunpowder for emerging firearms. The early hand cannons were crude, inaccurate, slow to reload, but they could punch through armor that would turn aside arrows and crossbow bolts. A peasant with a few weeks of training could kill a knight who'd spent years learning warfare. The military implications were staggering. By the 14th century, gunpowder formulas were state secrets. Kings guarded them as carefully as they guarded gold. Alchemists who knew the optimized recipes were valuable assets, protected and monitored. The knowledge was too important to allow it to spread freely. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. The church condemned alchemical experimentation as suspicious, potentially demonic, certainly dangerous to souls. But when that same experimentation produced weapons, suddenly it was acceptable, encouraged even. Princes funded alchemical research into better gunpowder. Church authorities blessed cannons before battles. The systematic approach that was problematic when applied to understanding matter's nature was perfectly fine when producing military advantage. Alchemists knew this. Some played the game, focusing their public work on gunpowder and metallurgy, while conducting more philosophically dangerous experiments in private. Others resented the hypocrisy, noting in private correspondence that the same methodology condemned in one context was celebrated in another. Gunpowder alchemy remained partially secret, even as the basic formula became widely known. Everyone knew the three ingredients, but the precise techniques for optimization, purification methods, ideal proportions for different applications, preparation procedures that maximized power and reliability, these remained trade secrets. Some alchemists deliberately spread false formulas, slight variations that would produce inferior powder, misleading competitors or potential enemies. A shift of a few percentage points in the ratios could mean the difference between effective powder and dangerous unreliability. The knowledge moved from alchemical laboratories to military arsenals, from coded manuscripts to practical application on battlefields. Castles that had stood for centuries fell to cannon fire. Knights in armor became obsolete. Warfare democratized in ways that undermined feudal power structures. Within a century of European alchemists refining Chinese gunpowder into an effective military technology, the medieval world was ending. Not because of philosophy or religious reformation or economic change, though all those played roles, but because alchemy had given ordinary people the power to kill nobles at a distance, to breach supposedly impregnable fortifications, to make expensive training and equipment militarily irrelevant. The powder that changed everything was created by men conducting systematic experiments, documenting results, refining procedures based on observed outcomes. Chemistry applied to warfare, and the world would never be the same. Gunpowder changed warfare. But another alchemical discovery changed how medieval people saw the world itself, and that's what really frightened the church. When alchemists discovered a liquid that could dissolve gold, they didn't just find a chemical reaction. They found proof that everything the church taught about the perfection and incorruptibility of matter might be wrong. Gold was perfect. This wasn't metaphor. It was official church-approved Aristotelian doctrine. Gold had achieved elemental perfection. It couldn't rust like iron, couldn't tarnish like silver, couldn't corrode like copper. It was incorruptible, unchangeable, eternal. The perfect metal, the perfect substance, the perfect material manifestation of perfection itself. And perfection meant something theologically. If gold was perfect and incorruptible, it reflected God's eternal, unchangeable perfection. The divine order was reflected in material reality. Perfect substances couldn't be destroyed because perfection was permanent. The hierarchy of matter, with dawned at the top, mirrored the divine hierarchy. Everything in its place, fixed, ordained, permanent. This wasn't just philosophy. It was how the medieval world understood reality. Matter had a hierarchy. Substances had fixed natures. The cosmos was ordered, stable, knowable because God had made it that way, and it couldn't fundamentally change. Then alchemists made aqua regia. The discovery built slowly. Alchemists already knew about vitriol, oil of vitriol, sulfuric acid, which they made by heating green vitriol, iron sulfate. They knew it was a powerful substance, caustic, dangerous. It could dissolve many metals, char organic matter, produce intense heat when mixed with water. They knew about nitra, saltpeter, potassium nitrate. Distilling it with vitriol produced aqua fortis, nitric acid, strong water. It could dissolve silver, which was impressive enough. Silver was a noble metal resistant to most corrosion. That a liquid could completely dissolve it suggested substances weren't as fixed as philosophy claimed. But silver wasn't gold. Silver could tarnish. It wasn't perfect. Somewhere, some alchemist. History doesn't record who, which suggests they understood the danger of claiming credit, tried combining acids, mixing aqua fortis with muriatic acid, hydrochloric acid, which was made from salt and vitriol through a different process. The combination created something new. Aqua regia, royal water. And royal water dissolved gold. Imagine being the first person to see this. You place a piece of gold into this clear liquid. Gold, which survives burial for centuries unchanged. Gold, which doesn't rust or corrode or decay. Gold, the perfect metal. And you watch it disappear. Not quickly, slowly. The liquid around the gold turns yellow, then orange. The gold itself seems to erode, small pieces breaking away, dissolving into solution. Keep watching, and eventually there's nothing left. The solid gold has become liquid. The perfect, incorruptible substance has been destroyed. Except, and this must have been equally stunning, you could get it back. Add the right reagents to the gold-containing solution, and the gold precipitates out, returns to solid form, recovered from what seemed like destruction. Gold could be dissolved and restored, transformed from solid to solution and back. The supposedly immutable could be mutated. The incorruptible could be corrupted, and then uncorrupted again. This was more than a chemical curiosity. It was a philosophical crisis. If gold could be dissolved, it wasn't incorruptible. If the perfect substance could be fundamentally altered, perfection wasn't permanent. If matter at the top of the supposed hierarchy could be transformed, the hierarchy itself was questionable. If humans could accomplish this through carefully prepared chemicals and systematic procedure, divine order wasn't as fixed as taught. The implications cascaded. If matter wasn't fixed in divine hierarchy, maybe nature operated according to discoverable principles rather than mysterious divine will. If systematic experimentation could reveal properties that contradicted official philosophy, maybe observation and testing were better guides to truth than ancient authorities. If acids could do what supposedly couldn't be done, what else that was supposedly impossible might actually be possible? Alchemists understood exactly how dangerous this knowledge was. Some wrote about aqua regia only in the most heavily symbolic code. The water that dissolves the sun. Gold was symbolized by the sun. The royal bath that humbles the king. Descriptions so obscured that without already knowing what they meant, you couldn't extract the actual chemical procedure. Others framed their discoveries in religious language. This wasn't contradicting divine order. It was revealing God's greater glory. The fact that matter could be transformed in such remarkable ways showed divine creation was even more intricate and wonderful than previously understood. By studying these transformations, they were studying God's handiwork in deeper detail. This defense was theologically clever, but philosophically dangerous. If God's creation operated differently than church doctrine claimed, who was wrong? The creation or the doctrine? Some alchemists simply kept quiet, shared the knowledge only with trusted colleagues, used aqua regia in their laboratories without publicizing the implications. The practical applications were valuable enough to justify the research without raising uncomfortable questions. Because practical applications existed, acid assaying became the standard method for testing gold purity. Mint operations used it to verify that coins contained the precious metal content they claimed. Dishonest merchants couldn't pass off gold-plated base metal as solid gold. Aqua regia would reveal the fraud. Acids enabled new metallurgical processes, etching armor and weapons with decorative patterns, separating gold from silver in mixed alloys, refining ores that couldn't be processed by traditional smelting. Mining operations depended on acids for extracting metals from complex mineral deposits. These uses gave alchemists cover. We're not challenging divine order. We're developing useful technologies. The acids are tools, not theological threats. Look at the practical benefit, not the philosophical implications. But the church wasn't stupid. They understood that tools had implications, that methods had meanings, that systematic experimentation, producing results which contradicted official doctrine, was threatening regardless of how useful the applications might be. The worst part, from the church's perspective, was that the discoveries were reproducible. This wasn't philosophical argument. It wasn't competing interpretation of texts. It was evidence. Verifiable, repeatable evidence. Anyone with the right equipment and knowledge could make aqua regia. Anyone could dissolve gold. The demonstration could be performed publicly. There was no hiding from it, no explaining it away. Gold dissolved. The supposedly incorruptible was corrupted. Reality contradicted doctrine. And if reality contradicted doctrine, which should be believed? For an institution whose authority rested on being the correct interpreter of truth, this was existential threat. Acids didn't just dissolve gold. They dissolved the certainty that church teachings about the natural world were reliable. They raised the possibility that systematic observation might reveal truths that authority didn't know, couldn't know, had gotten wrong. This was the danger alchemy posed. Not transmutation, not making gold. If alchemists could actually create gold, that would be economically disruptive, but philosophically manageable. The real threat was what alchemical discoveries demonstrated: that matter could be understood and manipulated through human effort, that systematic experimentation revealed natural laws, that observation trumped authority when they conflicted. Acids that dissolved gold dissolved more than metal. They dissolved the certainty of divine order, the reliability of ancient authorities, the church's monopoly on determining what was true about creation. That dissolution was far more threatening than any chemical reaction. But acids weren't the only discovery that challenged official teaching. In laboratories across Europe, alchemists were documenting observations about matter, transformation, and the natural world that suggested a very different reality than the one the church described.